In 1930, the most powerful empire the world had ever constructed, an empire that had subdued continents, rewritten the laws of nations, and bent the economies of entire civilizations to its will, faced an adversary unlike any it had ever encountered. Not a general, not a rival empire, not even a standing army. A 70-pound man in sandals, walking toward the sea to pick up salt. And somehow, this was the beginning of the end. How does that happen? How does a man with no weapons, no formal power, no institutional leverage, dismantle a global empire using nothing but the weight of moral clarity and the architecture of strategic inconvenience? This is not a story about a saint. It is a story about a strategist. A man who understood something that military theorists, economists, and political philosophers had largely failed to articulate, that the most durable power in human civilization is not the power that compels through fear, but the power that exposes the illegitimacy of force itself. This is the story of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And this is how he broke an empire. To understand Gandhi's weapon, you must first understand his wound. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on October 2, 1869, in Porbandar, a small coastal town in the Kathiawar region of what is now the Indian state of Gujarat. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, was a local administrator, a Diwan, a man of moderate influence in a world already being remade by British colonial authority. His mother, Putlabai, was devout, disciplined, and deeply shaped by the Jain philosophical tradition that permeated the region, a tradition that placed extraordinary moral weight on the concept of ahimsa, the principle of non-harm to all living beings. Young Gandhi absorbed this environment. But absorption is not the same as understanding. In those early years, Gandhi was, by his own later admission, a mediocre student and a timid boy. He was afraid of the dark, afraid of thieves and ghosts. He was, in almost every measurable way, an unlikely candidate to reshape the political history of the modern world. In 1888, at the age of 18, Gandhi sailed to London to study law. It was his first encounter with the empire not as an abstract force, but as a living civilization, and he was fascinated by it. He dressed in English suits. He took violin lessons. He attempted, with genuine earnestness, to become a proper English gentleman. He was not, at this stage, a revolutionary. He was an eager colonial subject trying to find his place in the architecture of an empire he had not yet learned to question. He returned to India in 1891 with his law degree and almost immediately failed. Professionally, personally, existentially. He couldn't find steady work. He was too shy to address courts effectively. He was, by any conventional measure, struggling. But then came South Africa, and South Africa changed everything. In 1893, Gandhi accepted a legal assignment in South Africa and boarded a ship for what he expected to be a year-long engagement. He would stay for 21 years. What happened in those 21 years was not simply a political education. It was a systematic, repeated, visceral confrontation with what racial empire actually felt like when applied to your body, your name, and your dignity. The pivotal moment came quickly. Just days after arriving in South Africa, Gandhi boarded a train in Pietermaritzburg, carrying a first-class ticket which he had legally purchased. A white passenger complained. A railway official ordered Gandhi to move to the third-class carriage. Gandhi refused. He was thrown off the train. He sat on the cold station platform through the night. Historians have marked this night as the birth of Gandhi's political consciousness. But what is often underestimated is the quality of the thinking that happened on that platform. Many people experience injustice. Far fewer experience it and immediately begin constructing a systematic theory of how to dismantle it. Gandhi did not sit on that platform and decide to fight. He sat on that platform and began to think. He began to ask the question that would define the next half-century of his life. What is the actual mechanism by which injustice sustains itself? And what, precisely, is the leverage point at which it becomes unsustainable? In South Africa, the injustice was elaborate and legally codified. The Natal Indian Congress, which Gandhi helped found in 1894, began fighting specific pieces of discriminatory legislation, but always through legal channels, through petitions, through legitimate political process. And those efforts met the wall that every colonized people eventually meet. The legitimate process is controlled by those whose interests the illegitimate system serves. It was during this period that Gandhi began experimenting with something more fundamental than legal protest. He began testing a different kind of pressure, one rooted not in the language of rights, but in the language of moral exposure. If the system depends on the cooperation of those it oppresses, what happens when that cooperation is withdrawn? What happens when the oppressed stand calmly in front of the machinery and refuse to move, and invite the machinery to crush them in plain sight? He called this concept Satyagraha. The word is Sanskrit, satya meaning truth, agraha meaning insistence or holding firmly. Truth force. Soul force. An insistence on truth so complete, so disciplined, so publicly maintained, that it forces the opponent to confront the moral reality of what they are doing. But here's what most people miss when they encounter this idea. Satyagraha, as Gandhi conceived and deployed it, was not primarily a moral philosophy. It was a political technology. A calculated, systematic method of applying pressure to power structures by exploiting their specific vulnerabilities. And to understand why it worked, you have to understand the specific vulnerabilities of the British Empire, because those vulnerabilities are precisely what Gandhi spent 2 decades learning to identify and exploit. Every weapon works because it is specifically designed for the vulnerabilities of its target. A sword is useless against a tank. A cyber attack is useless against a medieval castle. To understand why nonviolent resistance worked as a weapon against the British Empire, you first have to understand exactly what made the British Empire vulnerable, and specifically, vulnerable in ways that cannons and rifles were not. The British Empire by 1900 was the most expansive territorial and economic system in human history. But it was built on a foundation that contained a structural contradiction that would ultimately prove fatal, and Gandhi was among the first political actors to truly understand and systematically exploit it. Here is the contradiction. The British Empire justified itself morally. This was not window dressing. It was foundational. The empire was not presented to the British public or to the world as simple conquest and exploitation, though it was both of those things. It was presented as a civilizing mission, as a system of rational law and order, as the spread of progress, Christianity, and constitutional governance to peoples who, in the breathtaking arrogance of Victorian imperial ideology, were deemed not yet ready to govern themselves. This moral justification was not incidental, it was structural. The British public needed to believe they were doing good. The British Parliament needed to be able to articulate a moral case for the empire. British officers needed to be able to look themselves in the mirror. And increasingly, as the 20th century began, the international community, particularly the rising power of the United States, needed to believe that the British system represented something more than brute exploitation. This is the vulnerability. A system that justifies itself morally is specifically vulnerable to moral exposure. A system that claims to operate on the rule of law is vulnerable to people who follow the law more purely than the system itself does. A system that presents itself as rational governance is vulnerable to the spectacle of that governance behaving irrationally and brutally. Gandhi understood this with extraordinary clarity, and he designed Satyagraha as a machine for creating exactly that kind of moral exposure. The strategic architecture of Satyagraha operated on three simultaneous levels, and it is worth examining each in turn, because when you see them operating together, you begin to understand why it was so effective against this particular target. The first level was psychological. When trained satyagrahis, practitioners of nonviolent resistance, received beatings, imprisonment, or humiliation without retaliating and without backing down, something deeply uncomfortable happened to the people administering that violence. The ordinary psychological contract of oppression depends on the oppressed displaying fear, submission, or anger, all of which confirm the power of the oppressor and justify the continuation of force. When that contract is broken, when the person being beaten simply absorbs the blow and returns the next day, it creates profound psychological dissonance in the oppressor. It suggests, viscerally and unmistakably, that the force is not working. And force that is seen to not work is force that is being publicly humiliated. The second level was economic. And this is where Satyagraha revealed its most hard-edged strategic intelligence. The British Empire in India was not primarily a political project. It was an economic one. India was the empire's most valuable possession, a vast source of raw materials and, equally important, a captive market for British manufactured goods. The relationship was deliberately structured so that Indian raw materials, particularly cotton, were shipped to Britain, manufactured into cloth, and shipped back to India to be purchased by Indians. This arrangement systematically destroyed Indian domestic industry while ensuring maximum profit extraction from the colony. When Gandhi launched campaigns of economic non-cooperation, encouraging Indians to boycott British goods, to spin their own cotton, to withdraw their labor and their purchasing power from the imperial economic system, he was not making a symbolic gesture. He was attacking the revenue model of the empire directly. Every yard of khadi, the hand-spun homespun cloth that became one of Gandhi's most powerful symbols, was a direct withdrawal from British economic extraction. And when millions of people participated, the effect on British commercial interests was measurable and significant. The spinning wheel was not a romantic symbol. It was a weapon. Specifically, it was a weapon aimed at the economic architecture of empire. Gandhi required every member of the Indian National Congress to spin for at least 30 minutes every day. This was not meditation. This was deliberate economic sabotage, executed at a scale too vast for the empire to criminalize without revealing its own dependency. The third level, and in many ways the most sophisticated, was what we might call moral positioning. This is the element that the British found most impossible to counter, because every attempt to counter it made it worse. Gandhi's discipline required that satyagrahis not only refrain from violence, but actively demonstrate their willingness to accept suffering without retaliation. They were required to behave, in the face of imperial brutality, with a kind of dignified, sorrowful compassion. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of calm moral steadfastness that communicated unmistakably who in this confrontation held the moral high ground. This is where the strategy becomes clear. In an era of rising global communication, newspapers, telegraph, the beginning of newsreel film footage, the visual and narrative spectacle of a disciplined, peaceful population being beaten, imprisoned, and humiliated by the soldiers of a self-proclaimed civilizing empire was not merely morally uncomfortable. It was a strategic catastrophe for British legitimacy. Every act of imperial suppression became recruitment propaganda for the independence movement. Every cracked skull on a peaceful marcher was printed in London newspapers and American magazines. The empire was being forced to demonstrate, in full public view, that it could only sustain itself through violence against people who refused to be violent. And here is the elegant brutality of the trap Gandhi constructed. The British had exactly two choices when faced with Satyagraha, and both choices accelerated their decline. They could respond with violence, which destroyed their moral legitimacy, provoked international condemnation, and generated more committed independence activists out of every person who witnessed or experienced it. Or they could refrain from violence, which meant allowing the campaign of non-cooperation, economic boycott, and mass civil disobedience to continue unchallenged, steadily eroding the administrative and economic infrastructure of the empire. There was no good move. The weapon had been specifically designed to make both responses self-defeating. Gandhi tested and refined this weapon through 2 decades of campaigns in South Africa, the Natal Indian Congress's resistance to discriminatory legislation, the Great Satyagraha campaigns of 1906 to 1914 against the Black Act and the Indian Relief Bill, the 1913 march of over 2,000 miners across the Transvaal border in deliberate, disciplined mass illegal assembly. By the time Gandhi returned to India in 1915, welcomed as a hero, garlanded at every station, he was not arriving as a theorist. He was arriving as a field-tested strategist, with 20 years of empirical data about what forms of nonviolent resistance created sustainable pressure and what forms collapsed under imperial counterpressure. He was 45 years old, toughened by imprisonment and political struggle, and he carried with him a method that had been sharpened into something approaching a science. India and the British Empire were about to become his laboratory. Gandhi did not arrive in India in 1915 and immediately launch a revolution. This is one of the most revealing aspects of his strategic intelligence, his patience. His first mentor in the Indian political landscape, the veteran nationalist Gopal Krishna Gokhale, advised Gandhi to spend a year traveling India before speaking publicly about its politics. Gandhi followed this advice almost literally. He traveled. He listened. He went to the villages rather than the cities. He sought to understand the country not through newspapers or parliamentary debates, but through its people, and specifically through the texture of their suffering. What he found was systematic. The suffering was not accidental. It was the output of a deliberate economic and administrative system designed to extract maximum value from Indian labor, land, and resources while maintaining political control through a combination of legal structure, social division, and the ever-present threat of force. His first major political intervention in India, the Champaran Satyagraha of 1917, was at the local scale, and this was deliberate. In the Champaran district of Bihar, British planters had for generations forced Indian farmers to grow indigo on a fixed portion of their land under a system called Tinkathia, a coercive arrangement that trapped farmers in cycles of debt and prevented them from growing food for their families. Gandhi arrived, investigated, documented the abuses systematically, and mobilized the farmers in a campaign of non-violent non-compliance. The British authorities ordered him to leave. He refused. He was arrested. And immediately, something that the British had not anticipated happened. Thousands of peasants gathered outside the courthouse, completely peacefully, making it impossible to proceed with any sense of normalcy. The administration, confronted with the prospect of a trial that would attract international attention and expose the brutal mechanics of the indigo system, backed down. The Tinkathia system was abolished. It was a small victory, local, specific, agricultural. But it taught Gandhi something important about scale. The method worked, and India had 300 million people. What would happen if you applied this method not to a single district's farming policy, but to the entire structure of imperial rule? The catalyst for the first nationwide application of Gandhi's strategy came not from a single event but from an accumulation of imperial violence that finally exhausted Indian patience for incremental reform. The First World War had promised, through the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, meaningful steps toward Indian self-government in exchange for Indian loyalty and sacrifice. Hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers had died on European and Middle Eastern battlefields fighting for an empire they hoped might eventually set them free. Instead, in 1919, came the Rowlatt Act, legislation that allowed the colonial government to imprison people without trial for up to 2 years, specifically targeting political activity. It was, in effect, the British response to rising Indian nationalism. Not concession, but escalation. It was a declaration that the empire had no intention of loosening its grip. And then came Amritsar. On April 13, 1919, in the sacred city of Amritsar in Punjab, on Baisakhi, one of the most important festivals in the Sikh calendar, thousands of people had gathered in a walled public garden called Jallianwala Bagh. Many were there for the festival. Many had come to peacefully protest the Rowlatt Act. Most did not even know that public gatherings had been formally banned that day. Brigadier Reginald Dyer arrived with 50 soldiers. Without warning, without order to disperse, without any attempt to create an exit route, he ordered his men to open fire into the crowd. They fired continuously for approximately 10 minutes, until their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Official estimates placed the dead at 379. More credible independent estimates placed the number far higher, some accounts suggesting over 1,000 dead and more than 1,500 wounded in a garden from which there was almost no escape. What is perhaps most revealing about the Amritsar massacre is not the atrocity itself. Colonial systems are capable of atrocity. History has established this with exhaustive clarity, but the British response to it. Dyer faced a parliamentary inquiry. But in the House of Lords, he received a standing ovation from many members. A British newspaper launched a fund that raised over £26,000 for him, roughly £1.5 million in today's money. He was celebrated as a man who had saved India for the empire. This response, the casual, reflexive celebration of mass murder, communicated something to Indian nationalists more clearly than any political argument could. The empire was not a system that could be reformed from within. It was a system that celebrated the murder of its subjects when those subjects inconveniently sought their rights. Gandhi's response was the non-cooperation movement. Launched formally in 1920 under his leadership of the Indian National Congress, it was both the largest and the most systematically conceived act of mass civil resistance that colonial history had yet seen. The architecture of the movement was elegant in its simplicity. Indians were asked to withdraw their cooperation from every mechanism of British rule that could be withdrawn from without immediate physical harm. Lawyers were asked to stop practicing in British courts. Students were asked to withdraw from British-run schools and colleges. Government employees were asked to resign. British goods were to be boycotted. British honors and titles were to be returned. And all of this was to be done peacefully, without violence, without provocation, with the disciplined dignity that Gandhi had spent 2 decades refining. The response was enormous. Thousands of lawyers abandoned their practices. Hundreds of thousands of students walked out of colonial schools. The boycott of British cloth devastated commercial imports. Tens of thousands courted arrest. The jails of India began to fill with a very specific kind of prisoner, educated, disciplined, peaceful, willing, and utterly immune to the psychological mechanisms of humiliation that prison was meant to deploy. The administrative effect was significant. The British Empire ran India with a relatively small number of British administrators, never more than a few thousand governing over 300 million people. This was only possible because the empire relied on Indian collaboration at every level. Indian clerks, Indian lawyers, Indian police officers, Indian civil servants. When that collaboration began to be systematically withdrawn, the administrative machinery began to exhibit something it had never experienced at this scale: friction. But here is where Gandhi's movement encountered its first major crisis, and where we see both his strategic discipline and the fragility of nonviolent resistance as a tool for mass mobilization. In February 1922, in the town of Chauri Chaura in the United Provinces, a group of protesters clashed with police. When the police opened fire, the crowd turned violent. A police station was set on fire. 22 police officers were burned to death. Gandhi's response shocked the entire independence movement, and revealed something fundamental about the strategic rather than merely moral nature of his commitment to nonviolence. He called off the non-cooperation movement. Nationally. Immediately. Critics were furious. The movement was at its height. The empire was under unprecedented pressure. And Gandhi was halting everything because of one incident in one town. The great revolutionary Jawaharlal Nehru, who was in prison at the time, wrote that the news of the suspension felt like a physical blow. But Gandhi's logic was strategic, not sentimental. He understood that the moral authority of the movement, the specific thing that made it work, was its discipline. A campaign that claimed the high ground of nonviolence and then produced episodes of mass killing could not maintain the moral positioning that was the primary lever of its effectiveness. One Chauri Chaura, played in British newspapers, could undo the moral effect of 10,000 peaceful marches. Moreover, Gandhi understood something that military strategists understand about disciplined forces, that an untrained, undisciplined army is more dangerous to its own cause than to its enemy. The non-cooperation movement had swept up millions of participants in a wave of national energy. But those millions had not been rigorously trained in Satyagraha discipline. They were participants in a national mood, not practitioners of a specific method. And participants in a mood will respond to provocation in ways that practitioners of a method will not. His suspension of the movement was not a retreat. It was a recognition that the weapon required the maintenance of its specific working conditions to remain effective, and that those conditions had been compromised. 8 years passed between the suspension of non-cooperation and the next great wave of civil disobedience. 8 years during which Gandhi rebuilt organizational discipline within the Congress, negotiated unsuccessfully with the British for meaningful reforms, and watched the Nehru Report of 1928 fail to produce any constitutional progress towards self-government. By 1929, the Indian National Congress had formally adopted Purna Swaraj, complete independence, as its goal. Not dominion status, not incremental reform. Independence. And Gandhi was tasked with finding the strategic action that would make this demand impossible for the empire to ignore. What he chose was, on the surface, so modest that many of his political colleagues thought he had finally lost his strategic edge. Salt. The British salt laws prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt independently. All salt production and sale was controlled by the British colonial government, which collected a salt tax. This was not a large revenue source by imperial standards, but it was a perfect symbol. Salt is one of the most fundamental human necessities. Every person in India, regardless of religion, caste, income, or region, consumed it. The salt tax touched literally everyone. And it was enforced through law that explicitly criminalized Indians for touching a mineral that existed in abundance on their own coastline. Gandhi wrote to the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, on March 2, 1930, a letter of extraordinary strategic elegance. It was respectful, detailed, and devastating. It enumerated the economic harms of British rule with statistical precision, framed the Salt March as a final attempt to invite dialogue before direct action, and effectively gave the Empire a choice: engage seriously with the independence movement's demands, or watch what came next. Lord Irwin did not reply meaningfully. And so on March 12, 1930, Gandhi set off from his ashram at Sabarmati with 78 chosen followers, walking 240 miles to the coastal town of Dandi. The march took 24 days. And those 24 days may have been the most strategically productive 24 days in the history of the independence movement. Every step was covered by national and international press. Every night, Gandhi addressed the growing crowds with speeches that were simultaneously political addresses, moral arguments, and strategic communications to the watching world. By the time he reached Dandi, the world was watching. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi waded into the sea, picked up a handful of salt-encrusted mud, and broke the law of the British Empire. It was a precisely chosen, entirely symbolic, completely illegal act. And it unleashed something enormous. Within weeks, across thousands of miles of Indian coastline, hundreds of thousands of people were openly, defiantly, peacefully making and selling salt. The British found themselves in an impossible position. They could arrest hundreds of thousands of people for picking up salt on their own beaches, or they could stand by and watch their law be publicly and joyfully ignored on a continental scale. They chose mass arrest. Over 60,000 people were imprisoned in the weeks following the Salt March. And then came the moment that the international press captured with a clarity that no British press office could manage or explain away. At the Dharasana Salt Works in May 1930, a column of trained Satyagrahis, led by Gandhi's close colleague Sarojini Naidu, advanced in disciplined rows toward a heavily guarded salt depot. They had no weapons. They had been specifically trained to not raise their hands to protect themselves. They walked forward. The British police beat them with steel-tipped lathis. They fell. Another row walked forward. They were beaten. Another row. Another. Column after column of men walking calmly and deliberately into violence without raising a single hand against it. American journalist Webb Miller witnessed the scene and transmitted his report around the world. It appeared in over 1,000 newspapers. It was read by millions of people who had never thought closely about what the British Empire in India actually looked like from the inside. This was not accidental. This was the weapon achieving its designed effect with extraordinary precision. To fully understand why Gandhi's strategy worked, you need to spend some time inside the British position, because that position was far more constrained than the imperial exterior suggested. The British Empire in India in the 1920s and 1930s was not a confident, expanding system. It was a system increasingly aware of its own fragility, managing a complex and often contradictory set of pressures from multiple directions simultaneously. Economically, India had become less straightforwardly profitable. The cost of administration was rising. Indian industrial development, however deliberately stunted, meant that British manufactured goods faced increasing competition from domestic Indian producers. The First World War had dramatically increased Indian debt to Britain, but it had also strengthened Indian industrial capacity and Indian political consciousness. The economic relationship was becoming more expensive and less reliable. Administratively, the empire was stretched. The combination of Ireland's independence struggle, Egyptian nationalism, unrest in the Middle East mandates, and the rising tide of Indian nationalism meant that the apparatus of imperial management was being stressed across multiple fronts simultaneously. The men and money required to maintain control in India were men and money that were not available elsewhere, and the British establishment knew, at some level, that there were limits. But most critically, And this is the element that Gandhi had identified with extraordinary strategic precision. The British Empire was uniquely vulnerable to international legitimacy pressure in the early 20th century. The United States, which had emerged from World War I as the decisive financial and industrial power, was ideologically anti-colonial. American public opinion, shaped by its own history of colonial independence, was instinctively sympathetic to independence movements. American newspapers, when they ran stories of peaceful Indian protesters being beaten by British soldiers, generated genuine and politically significant public pressure on the British government. This is where the genius of Gandhi's media strategy becomes fully visible. Gandhi was not simply conducting a political campaign for Indian audiences. He was conducting a global communication strategy, using the spectacle of disciplined nonviolent resistance as content for an international press hungry for morally clarifying narratives. Every Satyagrahi who walked into a police baton without flinching was generating international pressure on British foreign policy. Every mass arrest was appearing in American and European newspapers as evidence of imperial brutality. The campaign was running on multiple theaters simultaneously, the streets of India and the front pages of the world, and both theaters were producing outcomes that damaged the empire's position. The British, facing this situation, deployed their standard repertoire of imperial management: negotiation, delay, partial concession, and when all else failed, force. But each element of this repertoire had been structurally disabled by Gandhi's strategy. Force backfired, as we have seen, because the discipline of Satyagraha converted every act of violence into moral ammunition for the independence movement. Negotiation was complicated because Gandhi was an extraordinarily skilled and patient negotiator who had spent decades learning to distinguish between genuine concession and tactical delay. Partial concession, the empire's favored tool for managing nationalist pressure in the interwar period, generated its own problems, because each concession acknowledged the legitimacy of the independence claim and raised public expectations for the next concession. The Government of India Act of 1935, which introduced provincial autonomy and expanded Indian participation in governance, was intended to defuse the independence movement through meaningful but limited reform. Instead, it gave the Indian National Congress experience in governing Indian provinces, building institutional competence, political networks, and administrative legitimacy that would prove directly applicable to self-governance after independence. Every move the empire made to manage the situation produced a version of what it was trying to prevent. The trap had closed, not suddenly, but through the slow, systematic accumulation of strategic pressure over 2 decades. Any honest account of Gandhi's political project must engage seriously with its internal contradictions, because those contradictions were real, consequential, and reveal both the limits of the method and the genuine complexity of the man himself. The most fundamental tension within the independence movement was the question of violence. Gandhi's insistence on nonviolence was not universally accepted among Indian nationalists, and it was not simply naivety or timidity that led others to question it. Bhagat Singh, the young revolutionary who was executed by the British in 1931 at the age of 23, represented a tradition of thought that held Gandhi's nonviolent framework to be not only insufficient but potentially counterproductive. Singh and his colleagues argued that the empire was, at its core, a system of organized violence, and that responding to organized violence with organized nonviolence was, in certain conditions, not nobility but strategic surrender. Bhagat Singh's execution, for the killing of a British police officer responsible for the death of a revered nationalist leader, provoked massive public anger across India. There were voices calling on Gandhi to demand clemency more forcefully, to use the political leverage the civil disobedience movement had created to insist on Singh's life being spared. Gandhi negotiated, appealed, and failed to save Singh. He was accused by many of insufficient urgency. The truth is more complicated. Gandhi did appeal to the viceroy, repeatedly, but the episode exposed a genuine tension. The moral authority of nonviolence came with real political constraints, and those constraints sometimes meant watching people die in ways that more confrontational politics might have prevented. There was also the profound and ultimately tragic fracture along religious lines. The relationship between Hindu and Muslim communities that Gandhi spent enormous personal capital trying to maintain, and that ultimately proved the deepest wound in the body of the independence movement. The Muslim League, under the increasingly formidable leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, represented a tradition of Indian Muslim political thought that was deeply skeptical of a Congress-led independence movement in a majority Hindu nation. Jinnah's argument, that Indian Muslims, as a distinct political community, required constitutional protections that a unitary democratic India dominated by Hindu majority politics could not reliably provide, was not simply communal manipulation, as some Congress supporters portrayed it. It was a serious political argument about the design of post-colonial governance, and Gandhi's responses to it were not always adequate to its complexity. Gandhi's own relationship with religion was sincere but politically ambiguous. His deeply personal spiritual language, his frequent invocations of Ram, his framing of political struggle in Hindu devotional terms, carried a cultural weight that resonated profoundly with India's Hindu majority but created genuine distance for Muslim and other non-Hindu communities. This was not cynical communalism on Gandhi's part. He was genuinely devoted to Hindu-Muslim unity, but the cultural vocabulary he deployed was not, despite his intentions, genuinely ecumenical. Gandhi's relationship with caste is another area where honest analysis requires us to sit with discomfort. Gandhi famously renamed the lowest caste Hindus, those designated untouchables in the traditional caste hierarchy, as Harijans, meaning children of God. He worked to bring them into the Congress coalition and campaigned vocally against the practice of untouchability. But Gandhi also, for much of his life, accepted the existence of the caste system as an organizing social principle, arguing that it served legitimate social functions if reformed of its abusive practices. B.R. Ambedkar, the brilliant Dalit jurist and scholar who led the Dalit political movement and would go on to draft India's constitution, regarded Gandhi's position as fundamentally inadequate. Ambedkar argued that the caste system could not be reformed, only abolished, and that Gandhi's Harijan approach, however well-intentioned, actually served to reinforce the system's legitimacy by softening its most visible brutalities without challenging its structural logic. This was not a marginal critique. It was a profound disagreement between two of the most important figures of the independence era about the most fundamental questions of justice, equality, and the social architecture of the nation they were building. The events that finally ended British rule in India were not, in truth, the product of Gandhi's campaigns alone, and this is something that honest analysis must acknowledge without diminishing what his campaigns actually achieved. The Second World War transformed the strategic and economic position of the British Empire in ways that made the retention of India increasingly untenable. Britain emerged from the war deeply in debt, largely to the United States, which had exacted significant political concessions as the price of wartime financial support. American anti-colonial pressure, which had been a consistent background factor since the 1920s, became in the post-war period a foreground political reality. Franklin Roosevelt had explicitly challenged Churchill on the question of Indian independence during the war. The Atlantic Charter's commitment to self-determination was cited by Indian nationalists with an embarrassing frequency that British diplomats found very difficult to manage. The war also demonstrated something that the British Empire's managers had privately feared for some time. India's cooperation with British rule was no longer reliable. The Quit India movement of 1942, Gandhi's most radical call for immediate independence, launched after the failure of the Cripps mission to negotiate a credible path to self-government, was met with mass imprisonments, including Gandhi himself, who spent 2 years confined in the Aga Khan Palace. The movement was ultimately suppressed, but the suppression required extraordinary administrative and military resources that the empire increasingly could not afford. And then came the Indian National Army, the force assembled by Subhas Chandra Bose, another nationalist who had broken with Gandhi over the question of violent resistance, who had collaborated with Japan and Germany during the war to assemble an Indian military force to fight against the British. The INA was ultimately defeated, its leadership captured and tried for treason. But the trials backfired dramatically. The defendants became heroes. The Royal Indian Navy Mutiny of February 1946, in which Indian naval personnel rose against their British officers, triggering sympathy strikes across Indian cities, demonstrated that the institutional fabric of imperial military control in India was beginning to tear. By the time Clement Attlee's Labour government came to power in Britain in 1945, replacing Churchill's wartime coalition, the strategic calculation had fundamentally changed. Attlee himself would later be quoted as saying that Gandhi's campaigns had been less decisive in ending British rule than the war had been, though this statement, taken out of its full context, is incomplete. What the war had done was create the conditions in which the accumulated pressure of decades of nonviolent resistance, economic disruption, and moral delegitimization became impossible to resist. The British didn't leave India because they chose to in an act of moral awakening. They left because the combination of Gandhi's systematic erosion of their legitimacy and support base, the economic devastation of the war, the shifting American political pressure, and the increasing unreliability of Indian institutional collaboration made the cost of staying higher than the benefit of the remaining extraction. Independence came on August 15, 1947. But it came packaged with catastrophe. The partition of British India into two nations, India and Pakistan, was the consequence of the failure, which Gandhi had devoted extraordinary personal energy to preventing, to maintain the political unity of the subcontinent across its religious communities. As many as 2 million people died in the communal violence that accompanied partition. 15 million were displaced in the largest mass migration in human history. Entire communities that had coexisted for generations across Punjab and Bengal tore themselves apart in an explosion of mutual terror. Gandhi spent the weeks around independence not in celebration, but in Calcutta and then Noakhali, fasting, walking, and placing his body, at the age of 77, directly between Hindu and Muslim communities engaged in mass killing. His presence, and his fasting, did help reduce violence in specific areas. But the scale of partition's catastrophe was beyond any individual to contain. On January 30, 1948, less than 6 months after independence, Gandhi was walking to an evening prayer meeting in Birla House in New Delhi. In the crowd waiting for him was a young Hindu nationalist named Nathuram Godse. Godse believed that Gandhi had been too accommodating to Muslims, that his insistence on Hindu-Muslim unity, and specifically the hunger strike Gandhi had recently undertaken to force the Indian government to release funds owed to Pakistan, represented a betrayal of the Hindu nation. Godse stepped forward. He bowed, and he shot Gandhi 3 times in the chest. Gandhi fell, reportedly speaking the words he ram, "O God." The man who had bent the British Empire died at the hands of a Hindu nationalist who believed he had betrayed India. The question of Gandhi's legacy requires the kind of intellectual honesty that hero worship specifically prevents. Because the mythologized Gandhi, the gentle saint in white, the universal symbol of peaceful resistance, actually does a disservice to the real Gandhi by making it impossible to accurately assess what he actually achieved, how he achieved it, and when and where the method he developed is and is not transferable. Let us start with the question that has generated the most debate. Did nonviolence alone achieve Indian independence? The honest answer is no. And acknowledging this is not a diminishment of Gandhi's achievement. It is, in fact, the only way to accurately understand it. Indian independence in 1947 was the product of a convergence of forces, of which Gandhi's campaigns were one, the most important one, in terms of creating the domestic political and moral conditions for independence, but not the only one. The Second World War's destruction of British economic capacity and imperial self-confidence was essential. The shift in American foreign policy toward anti-colonialism was significant. The Indian National Army and the Royal Indian Navy mutiny demonstrated that the coercive infrastructure of empire was no longer reliable. The Labour government's political will to decolonize was necessary. Gandhi's campaigns did not, by themselves, make independence inevitable. What they did was systematic and cumulative. They built a mass political consciousness among a population that had been deliberately fragmented by imperial policy. They created a framework of national identity, the Congress as a genuinely pan-Indian political movement that could survive decades of imperial suppression. They developed the organizational capacity and the political legitimacy that meant independence, when it came, could be transferred to a functioning political entity rather than a chaos. And critically, they delegitimized the empire continuously, publicly, and at scale, so that when the economic and strategic factors aligned for withdrawal, the political will to stay had already been largely exhausted. The global legacy of Gandhi's method is both real and more limited than the mythological version suggests. Martin Luther King Jr.'s invocation of Gandhi is perhaps the most famous example of the method's transferability, and it is genuine. King studied Gandhi carefully, traveled to India, and applied Satyagraha principles with conscious deliberateness to the American civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, the Birmingham campaigns, all bear the structural fingerprints of Gandhian strategy. Economic disruption, moral positioning, psychological pressure, and the deliberate creation of visual spectacle that forces the dominant society to confront the ugliness of its own system. And it worked, partially, in specific conditions, against a specific kind of target. Because the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, like the British Empire in the 1920s and 1930s, was a system that justified itself morally and was therefore vulnerable to moral exposure. American democracy claimed to stand for liberty and equality. The spectacle of peaceful black protesters being beaten by police dogs in Birmingham, Alabama, broadcast on national television, created exactly the kind of moral legitimacy crisis that Gandhian strategy is specifically designed to produce. But the method has also failed conspicuously and tragically in contexts where the target was not vulnerable to moral pressure. Gandhi himself recognized this with characteristic honesty when asked, during the Second World War, what the Jews of Europe should do in response to Nazi persecution. His advice, that they should practice nonviolent resistance, was met with the obvious and devastating rejoinder: the Nazis had demonstrated their complete indifference to moral opprobrium. A system that does not justify itself morally, that does not depend on international legitimacy, that has no free press to carry the spectacle of its violence to audiences that matter. Such a system is not vulnerable to the specific leverage that Satyagraha applies. This is not a criticism of Gandhi's method. It is a recognition of what the method actually is: a precisely designed weapon for a specific class of target. It works against systems that are morally self-justifying, institutionally visible, democratically accountable, and dependent on the cooperation of those they govern. Against systems with none of these properties, it provides no leverage. Nelson Mandela's path was instructive in a different way. Mandela began his political life deeply influenced by Gandhi. The African National Congress's early campaigns borrowed explicitly from Gandhian strategy, not least because Gandhi had himself been politically active in South Africa. But Mandela, confronting the apartheid regime after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, concluded that nonviolent resistance alone was insufficient against a system willing to massacre peaceful protesters. He co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, and accepted imprisonment rather than renounce the right to armed resistance. And yet Mandela also ultimately helped achieve liberation through negotiation rather than military victory through a political settlement that required the apartheid regime to accept that the cost of continued resistance had become unacceptably high. The combination of international economic sanctions, domestic resistance, and the internal fractures of the apartheid system produced an outcome that neither pure nonviolence nor armed struggle alone had been able to achieve. Gandhi's most durable legacy may not be any specific political outcome, not even Indian independence, but the introduction of a new category of political actor and a new vocabulary of power into the modern world. Before Gandhi, the dominant frameworks of political resistance were essentially binary. You worked within the system through legal and electoral means, or you used force to overthrow it. Gandhi demonstrated, empirically, that there was a third option, one that operated in the space between legal compliance and violent revolution, applying systematic pressure at the specific points where power was most vulnerable without giving power the excuse or the pretext to eliminate you. This was not a moral discovery. It was a political discovery. A discovery about the architecture of power, about the leverage points of legitimacy, about the relationship between a system's self-justifying ideology and its actual behavior, and about what happens when that gap is systematically and publicly exposed. Whether you admire Gandhi or not, whether you accept his method or not, this discovery, this expansion of the political vocabulary, is real and measurable. It is present in every peaceful protest movement, every economic boycott, every act of mass civil disobedience that has shaped the political landscape of the modern world. We began with a paradox, a thin, unarmed man against a global empire. We can now see that the paradox was always more apparent than real. Gandhi was not unarmed. He carried a weapon of extraordinary sophistication, a weapon that had been designed specifically for the vulnerabilities of its target, tested over 2 decades of political experimentation, and deployed with the patience and strategic discipline of a master player in a very long game. The British Empire was not an unconquerable monolith. It was a system held together by specific structural requirements: moral legitimacy, economic extraction, administrative cooperation, international credibility, and Gandhi spent his life systematically attacking each of those requirements simultaneously, using the only tool that could not be countered without making the problem worse. Was it enough by itself? No. The empire's decline had many causes. Was it decisive? Yes, because without the moral delegitimization, without the mass political consciousness, without the organizational architecture that Gandhi built over decades, the other factors that brought independence might have produced a very different outcome: fragmentation, continued dominion status, a negotiated half-freedom rather than genuine sovereignty. But the question that lingers, the question that Gandhi himself, in his more honest moments, did not fully answer, is this: was his method a discovery of a universal principle of political power? Or was it a brilliantly designed solution to a very specific problem? The problem of how to dismantle a particular kind of empire in a particular historical moment. The evidence suggests something between these two positions. Nonviolent resistance, as Gandhi conceived and deployed it, is not universally applicable. It requires a target with specific vulnerabilities. It requires a degree of organizational discipline that is extraordinarily difficult to maintain at scale. It requires participants willing to absorb extraordinary personal suffering in service of strategic goals they may never live to see achieved. And it requires, this is perhaps the most uncomfortable admission, a level of global media visibility and international audience sympathy that is not equally available to all struggles. The struggles that Gandhian methods have most clearly influenced, the American Civil Rights Movement, the Solidarity Movement in Poland, the Velvet Revolution, were all, in different ways, operating in the light of international attention. They had audiences. They had the specific leverage that comes from making the contradiction between a system's claims and its behavior visible to people whose opinion the system cared about. Gandhi's assassination, 6 months after independence, by a man who believed he had betrayed the Hindu nation, contains its own dark lesson. The forces he had spent his life trying to hold together, the fractures of religion, caste, community, the enormous centrifugal pressures of a civilization that had been deliberately divided by imperial policy, did not hold. The unity he believed in, the India he was trying to build, was already fragmenting around him before the bullets hit. There is something in this that resists the comfortable ending. The man who broke an empire could not stop a partition. The man who taught the world a new vocabulary of power could not prevent the ancient vocabularies of identity and violence from reasserting themselves the moment empire withdrew. And perhaps that is the final, most important lesson of Gandhi's story, that the hardest empire to dismantle is not the one imposed from outside, with soldiers and administrators and tax collectors. It is the one that lives inside. The hierarchies, the divisions, the mutual fears that colonial rule exploited and deepened but did not create. Gandhi understood this. He spent his life attacking both empires simultaneously. He succeeded against the external one. The internal one, the one that killed him, remains, in various forms and by various names, the central political challenge of the country he helped liberate. So, was Gandhi's method a universal weapon? Or a context-specific tool wielded by an extraordinary strategist against a uniquely vulnerable target at a uniquely favorable moment in history? The question is not a rhetorical one. Your answer to it determines whether you believe that nonviolent resistance is something that can be taught, replicated, and deployed against the structures of power that define your own time, or whether it was, in the end, a beautiful and unrepeatable accident of history. Gandhi himself, I think, would have had no patience for the question. He would have said, pick up the salt. Start walking. And discover, step by step, which kind of empire you're dealing with.